My father slapped me on his birthday, and no one stopped him. And for a moment, the room went completely silent, not because what happened was shocking, but because no one was surprised. I stood there with my hands at my sides, my heart steady, my face calm, while the people around us looked away, pretending they had not just witnessed something they did not want to acknowledge. I did not react. I did not speak. I simply turned slightly and picked up my glass from the table, placing it down, with the same care I always used, because losing control in that moment would have given him exactly what he wanted. I am glad you are here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you are watching from, because what happened after that night changed everything I thought I understood about my family. The dining room was decorated for his birthday. Soft lights, a cake in the center of the table, plates carefully arranged, everything designed to celebrate him, to honor him, and yet the air felt heavy, like something had been building long before that moment. My father stood at the head of the table, his posture firm, his presence commanding in the way it had always been, the kind of authority that did not need to be questioned because no one had ever been allowed to question it. I had spent weeks planning that evening, choosing the menu, inviting the guests, making sure everything was exactly the way he liked it. Because that was what I had always done. I made things smooth. I made things work. I made sure no one noticed the tension beneath the surface. But that night, something shifted, not in him, but in me. He raised his voice first, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the room, making a comment about how I had never achieved anything on my own. And there was a ripple of uncomfortable laughter from one of the guests, quickly silenced when no one else joined in. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw something I had ignored for years. Not strength, not leadership, but control, the kind that depends on everyone else staying small. And when I did not respond the way he expected, when I did not apologize or shrink or explain, something in his expression changed, just for a second, like a crack forming in something carefully maintained. The moment passed quickly, the room returning to its quiet discomfort, conversations starting again in low voices, glasses clinking softly, as if normalcy could be forced back into place. I stepped back from the table, my movements slow, deliberate, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something I had not fully accepted before. This was not an isolated moment. It was a pattern, one that had shaped my life for longer than I cared to admit. I walked toward the hallway, away from the lights, away from the voices, my footsteps quiet against the floor, and as I reached the door, I paused for just a second, not to look back, but to recognize that something had ended in that room, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because for the first time, I was not leaving in silence out of fear. I was leaving because I finally understood what staying had cost me, and as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I did not feel broken. I felt clear, and somewhere deep inside, something steady began to take shape, something that would not need to be seen to exist, something that would not ask for permission to grow, and I realized that what happened that night was not the moment I lost everything. It was the moment I stopped giving it away. I did not go back inside after I stepped out into the night. The sound of laughter and forced conversation fading behind the closed door as if it belonged to a different life. I stood there for a moment on the front porch, the cool air steady against my skin, grounding in a way the room inside never was. My hands were still, my breathing even. And for the first time in years, I was not trying to figure out how to fix what had just happened. I was simply observing it. The way you observe something you finally understand. I walked to my car without rushing, each step deliberate, not because I was unsure, but because I knew there was nothing left for me in that house tonight. The drive home was quiet, the city lights passing by in soft reflections across the windshield, familiar streets that suddenly felt distant, like I was seeing them from a different place entirely. When I arrived at my apartment, I did not turn on the television or check my phone. I placed my keys on the counter and stood in the silence, letting it settle around me without interruption. It was not empty. It was clear. I moved slowly through the space, noticing the small things I had chosen for myself. The simple furniture, the books on the shelf, the window that overlooked the street below. Everything here had been built without his approval, without his input, and that realization felt different now. It felt significant. I sat down at the small table by the window and rested my hands in front of me, my thoughts not scattered, not overwhelmed, just focused, because what happened tonight was not an isolated moment. It was a confirmation, a pattern that had been there for years, repeating itself in smaller ways, quieter ways, ways I had dismissed or explained away. I remembered conversations where my decisions were questioned, where my achievements were minimized, where every step forward I took was somehow reduced to something less, and I had accepted it, not because I believed it, but because it was easier than challenging it, easier than disrupting the balance that kept everything functioning. But now that balance no longer existed, and I could see it clearly. I stood up and walked to the cabinet, pulling out a small folder I had not opened in months, placing it on the table with careful precision. Inside were documents, statements, records I had kept without fully acknowledging their importance, not hidden, just waiting. I opened it slowly, scanning the pages, the numbers, the details that told a story separate from the one my father believed, a story of ownership, of responsibility, of decisions made quietly but intentionally. And as I turned each page, something settled deeper within me. Not anger, not urgency, just clarity. Because I understood now that what happened tonight was not something I needed to respond to emotionally. It was something I needed to respond to correctly. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. The weight of it steady, real, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it would mean to stop accepting his version of reality, to step into my own without hesitation, without explanation. I looked out the window at the street below, the lights steady, the world moving forward without pause, and I realized that nothing had actually changed tonight except my understanding of it. And that was enough, because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it, and once you understand the truth of something, you cannot pretend it is anything else. And as I stood there in the quiet of my own space, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by fear or habit. It would be shaped by something far simpler, something far stronger, the decision to stop standing. Still, I did not sleep that night, not because I was restless, but because my mind was finally quiet in a way it had not been before. I sat at the table with the folder still in front of me, the pages spread out in careful order, each document holding a piece of something I had never fully claimed as my own. The soft light from the lamp cast a warm glow across the paper, and for the first time, I read everything without hesitation, without minimizing what it meant. The trust agreement, the signatures, the dates, all pointing to a reality I had accepted without question for years, that everything was under his control, when in truth, it had never been that simple. I traced one line with my finger, my name printed clearly where I had never thought to look twice, and I felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper inside me. Not sudden, not overwhelming, just steady, like something aligning into place. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, remembering how often I had been told what I could or could not do, how decisions were always explained to me as if I were part of something, but never in control of it, how my role had been defined so completely that I had stopped questioning it. But now the structure of that belief was starting to shift, piece by piece. I opened my eyes and reached for my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found a name I had not called in a long time. Daniel Brooks, an attorney who had once helped with paperwork years ago. Someone I remembered as careful, precise, someone who asked questions instead of assuming answers. I hesitated for just a second, not out of doubt, but because I understood that this was the moment things would begin to move, and once they did, there would be no returning to what had been before. I pressed call, holding the phone to my ear as it rang, the sound steady, grounding, and when he answered, his voice calm and professional, I introduced myself, my tone even, my words measured, explaining only what was necessary, that I had documents I needed reviewed, that I wanted to understand my position clearly. There was a pause on the other end, not of confusion, but of consideration, and then he agreed to meet, setting a time for the following morning. I thanked him and ended the call, placing the phone back on the table with the same care I had used for everything else that night. The room felt unchanged, but I was not. I gathered the papers slowly, aligning them into a single stack, placing them back into the folder, closing it with a quiet sense of finality. This was not about reacting to what happened at the party. It was about understanding what had always been there beneath it. And as I stood up and walked toward the window, the first light of morning beginning to appear on the horizon, I realized that for the first time, I was not waiting for someone else to define what came next. I was preparing to define it myself. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt different from every other morning before it. Not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. I dressed slowly, choosing simple clothes that felt like my own rather than something selected to meet someone else's expectations. The mirror reflected a version of me that had always been there but rarely acknowledged, steady, composed, and no longer waiting for permission to exist. I picked up the folder from the table, holding it firmly but without tension, and stepped out into the day. The air crisp, the sky pale with early light. Everything ordinary, everything unchanged except for the direction I was moving in. Daniel's office was located in a quiet building downtown, not imposing, not extravagant, just precise and functional, the kind of place where details mattered more than appearances. When I entered, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and asked me to take a seat. I nodded and sat down, placing the folder on my lap, my hands resting lightly on top of it. My posture relaxed. There was no anxiety, no urgency, only a calm awareness that I was exactly where I needed to be. When Daniel stepped into the waiting area, he recognized me immediately, his expression professional but warm. "It has been a while," he said, and I returned a small nod. "It has," I replied, following him into his office. The room was neat, organized, with shelves of files and a large desk positioned near a window that let in soft, natural light. I took the seat across from him and placed the folder on the desk, opening it carefully, sliding the documents toward him without explanation. He began reviewing them in silence, his eyes moving steadily across each page, occasionally pausing, occasionally turning back, not rushing, not assuming, and I watched him, not searching for reassurance, but observing the process itself, the way he approached the information without bias, without the narrative I had lived under for years. After a few minutes, he leaned back slightly, his fingers resting together as he looked at me with a different expression now, one that carried both understanding and something else, something closer to concern. "Have you been aware of what this means?" he asked, his voice calm, direct. I held his gaze, my answer simple. "Not fully, until now." He nodded once, as if that confirmed something for him. And then he began to explain, not in dramatic terms, not in absolutes, but in clear, precise language, outlining the structure of the trust, the ownership tied to my name, the authority that had never actually been transferred away. And as he spoke, each word settled into place with a quiet certainty, not surprising, not overwhelming, just confirming what I had started to understand on my own. "Based on these documents," he continued, "the control over these assets is not where you were led to believe it was." I listened without interruption, my hands still, my expression unchanged, because the realization was no longer emotional. It was factual, measurable, undeniable. He closed the folder gently, resting his hand on top of it. "If you choose to act on this, the outcome will not be small," he said, not as a warning, but as a statement, and I nodded slowly, not because I needed time to decide, but because I had already made that decision before I walked into this room. I reached forward and closed the folder myself, my fingers pressing lightly against the cover, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of what it represented, not just documents, not just numbers, but the truth that had been there all along, waiting for me to recognize it. And as I looked back at Daniel, my voice steady, I spoke without hesitation. "Then let us begin." The next few days did not feel rushed, they felt deliberate, like each step had been placed carefully before I took it. Daniel moved with quiet efficiency, requesting additional records, organizing timelines, building something structured and undeniable from pieces that had existed for years but had never been brought together in this way. I followed his guidance without hesitation, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this process required precision, not emotion. I returned to my apartment each evening with a growing sense of clarity, reviewing documents, recalling details I had once dismissed, every conversation, every decision that had been presented to me as final, now revealing itself as something far more controlled than I had realized. I did not confront my father. I did not call or explain or question anything. I allowed everything to remain exactly as it had been, because the truth did not need to be announced. It needed to be established. One afternoon, Daniel called to confirm that everything was ready, his voice steady, his tone unchanged, but there was a quiet shift beneath it, something that suggested the weight of what had been prepared. "We will file tomorrow morning," he said, and I nodded even though he could not see me. Understood, I replied, my voice calm. The same calm that had carried me through each step so far. That night, I sat at my table again, the folder now thicker, more complete, resting in front of me. I did not open it. I did not need to. I already knew what it contained, what it represented. Instead, I looked around the room, the same space that had felt like a place of quiet reflection just days ago, now holding something different, not tension, not anticipation, but certainty, because I was no longer observing my situation, I was shaping it. The following morning, I woke before sunrise, the same early hour that had once belonged to routine, now belonging to something else entirely. I dressed with the same simplicity, the same intention, and stepped outside into the cool air, the city just beginning to wake, everything moving forward as it always did, unaware of the shift taking place within it. When I arrived at Daniel's office, the process moved quickly, signatures placed where they needed to be, documents submitted with quiet finality, no dramatic declarations, no visible confrontation, just a series of actions that set something irreversible into motion. Daniel reviewed everything one last time before looking up at me, his expression composed. From this point forward, things will begin to change, he said, and I met his gaze without hesitation. They already have, I replied, and he gave a small nod, as if he understood exactly what I meant. I left the office shortly after, stepping back into the daylight, the street unchanged, the people around me moving in their own directions, unaware that a decision had just been made that would alter the course of something much larger than it appeared. I walked slowly, not because I needed time, but because I recognized the moment for what it was, not an ending, not yet, but the beginning of something that had been waiting for far too long. And as I continued forward, I realized that the silence I had carried for years was no longer something that held me in place. It had become something else entirely, something that allowed me to move without hesitation, without doubt, and without the need to explain myself to anyone at all. The days after everything was filed passed with a strange kind of quiet, not the uneasy silence I had known before, but something steadier, something that no longer depended on what my father said or did. I continued my routine as if nothing had changed, waking early, moving through my apartment with the same deliberate pace, making coffee, sitting by the window, but beneath those familiar actions, something had shifted completely. I was no longer reacting to my life. I was waiting for it to unfold. My phone rang late that afternoon, his name appearing on the screen, and for a brief moment, I simply looked at it, not with hesitation, not with fear, just with recognition. Because this call had always been inevitable, I let it ring once more before answering, my voice calm. Hello. There was no greeting on his end, only a sharp breath, followed by a tone I had heard my entire life, controlled, demanding. What did you do? He asked, and I could almost picture him standing in his office, the same place where he had always believed himself to be in control. I did not respond immediately, not to create tension, but because I did not need to rush. I reviewed what was already mine. I said simply, my words measured. His silence on the other end was different from the silence at the party. This one carried confusion, something unsettled. You went behind my back, he said, but the certainty in his voice was thinner now, less solid. I stood by the window, looking out at the street below, people moving through their lives without awareness of this moment. No, I replied. I stopped standing in front of it. There was a pause, longer this time, and I could feel the shift. The slow realization that something he had always assumed was fixed was no longer within his reach. You do not understand how this works, he said, but the words lacked the authority they once carried. I closed my eyes for just a second, not out of frustration, but out of clarity. I understand it now, I answered, and that was the truth, not learned overnight, not discovered in a single moment, but built piece by piece until it could no longer be ignored. His voice changed then, not louder, not softer, but different, searching for something that was no longer there. We need to talk about this, he said, and I almost smiled, not because it was ironic, but because it was familiar, the same attempt to bring things back into a space he could manage. There is nothing to discuss, I replied calmly. Everything has already been submitted. The words settled between us with a quiet finality, and for the first time, he had no immediate response, No correction, no redirection, just silence. I let it remain that way, not filling it, not softening it. Because this silence was no longer something I needed to carry for him. It belonged to him now. After a few seconds, I ended the call, not abruptly, not dramatically, just as one ends something that has reached its natural conclusion. I placed the phone down and returned to my seat by the window, the light outside beginning to shift as evening approached, the world continuing forward as it always did, and I sat there, not waiting, not wondering, just present, because whatever happened next was no longer something I needed to anticipate. It was something that would arrive on its own, shaped by decisions that had already been made. And as the room settled into quiet once again, I realized that the control I had once believed belonged to someone else had never truly been theirs. It had only ever been something I allowed, and now that I had taken it back, there was nothing left for anyone else to hold. The notice arrived without ceremony. A simple envelope placed among the rest of the day's mail, indistinguishable at first glance from anything else. And yet the moment I saw the return address, I understood exactly what it was. I picked it up slowly, turning it once in my hands before opening it, not out of hesitation, but because I recognized the weight of what it represented. Inside were the official documents, stamped, processed, acknowledged, everything that had been set in motion, now moving forward beyond intention and into reality. I read through the pages carefully, not rushing, not skimming, each line confirming what had already been established: the transfer of authority, the restructuring of control, the formal recognition of what had always existed beneath the surface, my name present where it had once felt distant, now clear, direct, undeniable. I placed the papers on the table and sat down, my hands resting lightly beside them. The room quiet, unchanged, but the meaning of everything within it subtly different. My phone vibrated shortly after, another call from him, and this time, I did not let it ring as long. I answered, my voice steady. Yes. There was no attempt to control his tone now, no measured authority, only urgency held tightly beneath the surface. You received something, he said, not asking, not fully stating, and I allowed a small pause before responding. I did. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with something he was trying to hold together, something that no longer aligned the way it once had. This is not final, he said, but the words did not carry the same certainty. They sounded like something being repeated rather than believed. I stood up and walked toward the window, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor, steady, indifferent. It is already in motion, I replied, not correcting him, not challenging him, just stating what was true. There was a shift on the other end of the line, a change in breathing, a pause that lingered just a second too long. And in that moment, I understood that he was no longer speaking from control. He was reacting. You could have come to me, he said, and for a brief second, I considered that, not as a possibility, but as a reflection of everything that had defined our dynamic for years. I looked out at the street below, people moving without awareness of this conversation, their lives continuing forward, untouched. I did, I said quietly. For years, the words settled into the space between us, not sharp, not emotional, just clear, and there was no immediate response, no correction, no attempt to redirect, only silence. The kind that arrives when something can no longer be explained away. I let it remain there, not filling it, not easing it, because this silence no longer belonged to me. After a few moments, he spoke again, but his voice had changed, not in volume, but in certainty. This will not end the way you think, he said, and I recognized it. The last attempt to hold on to something familiar, something predictable. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them, my reflection faint in the glass, steady, present. It already has, I answered, and this time, when the silence followed, it felt complete, not waiting, not uncertain, just final. I ended the call gently and placed the phone down, returning to the table where the documents rested, the edges aligned, the ink still fresh, and as I sat there, I did not feel anticipation or doubt, only a quiet recognition that what had once seemed immovable was already shifting, and whatever remained would not be determined by what had been said in the past, but by what had now been set into motion. The courtroom did not feel dramatic when I walked in. It felt controlled, structured, every movement measured and contained within quiet rules that no one needed to explain. I took my seat beside Daniel, placing my hands calmly in front of me, the same steady posture I had carried from the very beginning. Across the room, my father sat with his own counsel, his posture still upright, but something in his presence had shifted, not visibly to anyone who did not know him, but unmistakable to me. The certainty that once defined him was no longer solid. It had been replaced with something more fragile, something that required effort to maintain. The judge entered, and the room rose briefly before settling again into stillness. Documents were presented, statements outlined, each step moving forward with quiet precision. There were no raised voices, no sudden reactions. Just a steady unfolding of information that had already been prepared, already established. Daniel spoke clearly, his tone even, presenting the structure of the trust, the documentation of ownership, the pattern of control that had been assumed rather than legally held. I listened without interruption, my gaze forward, not fixed on anyone in particular, because this moment was not about confrontation. It was about confirmation. When it was my father's turn, he spoke with the same measured authority he had always used, explaining his perspective, framing everything within the narrative he had relied on for years. But there was something different now, a slight hesitation between his words, a subtle shift in tone that suggested he was no longer entirely certain of the ground beneath him. The judge listened without expression, reviewing the documents with careful attention, occasionally asking questions, not to challenge, but to clarify, each answer narrowing the space where assumption could exist, until only fact remained. The room felt still, but not tense, just focused, as if everything unnecessary had been removed, leaving only what mattered. After what felt like both a moment and a long stretch of time, the judge spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that carried through the entire room, outlining the decision based on the evidence presented, confirming the authority tied to my name, the misalignment of control, the necessary adjustments that would now take place. I did not react outwardly. I did not shift in my seat or change my expression, because nothing that was said felt surprising. It felt accurate. My father remained still, his gaze fixed ahead, but I could see it then, the exact moment the realization reached him, not fully, not all at once, but enough to alter something fundamental, enough to disrupt the certainty he had held on to for so long. The proceedings concluded without spectacle, documents finalized, timelines established, everything moving forward as part of a system that did not need emotion to function. I stood when it was appropriate, gathering my things with the same care I had shown from the beginning, and as I stepped out of the courtroom into the hallway, the light outside softer, quieter, I understood that what had happened was not a sudden victory. It was the natural result of something that had been waiting to be recognized. And as the door closed behind me, separating that room from the rest of the world, I realized that nothing had been taken, not truly. It had only been returned to where it had always belonged. I did not look back as I walked down the courthouse steps. The sound of the door closing behind me soft but final, the air outside warmer than I expected, carrying the quiet movement of a world that had not paused for anything that had just happened. People passed by without noticing. Conversations continued. Cars moved steadily along the street. And for the first time, I felt completely separate from the version of my life that had once been defined by someone else's voice. Daniel said something beside me. A brief confirmation about next steps, timelines, formalities, and I nodded, listening but not holding on to every detail. Because the most important part had already been decided, not in that courtroom, but long before I ever walked into it. I thanked him, my tone steady, my expression calm, and we parted without ceremony. No celebration, no acknowledgement of victory, just a quiet understanding that the process had reached its conclusion. I continued walking, my pace unhurried, my steps aligned with something internal rather than external. And as I reached the edge of the street, I paused, not because I needed direction, but because I recognized the moment for what it was, not an ending in the dramatic sense, but a closing that required no explanation. My phone vibrated once in my hand, his name appearing again, and I looked at it for a brief second, not with hesitation, not with emotion, just with recognition, the same name that had once carried weight, authority, expectation, now just a name, nothing more. I let it ring until it stopped, placing the phone back into my bag without answering, because there was nothing left to respond to, no conversation that would return anything that had already been resolved. I stepped forward again, crossing the street as the light changed, the city continuing its rhythm around me, and I felt something settle quietly within me, not relief, not triumph, but something more stable, more complete, the absence of something that had once been constant, the need to be seen through someone else's perspective. I reached the corner and turned, the courthouse now behind me, its presence already fading into the background of everything else, and I understood that what had been taken from him was never truly mine to give. It had only been something he believed he controlled, something I had allowed by staying silent, and now that silence no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me, shaped into something deliberate, something chosen. I stopped briefly in front of a small cafe, the glass reflecting my image back at me, and for a moment, I studied it, not searching for change, but recognizing it. The same face, the same posture, and yet something entirely different. Beneath it, not defined by resistance, not shaped by reaction, just present. I opened the door and stepped inside, the soft sound of conversation and the scent of coffee filling the space. Ordinary, simple, unchanged, and I realized that this was what moving forward looked like, not dramatic, not loud, just steady, intentional, and entirely my own. I ordered a cup of coffee and took a seat by the window, placing my bag beside me, my hands resting lightly on the table, and as I looked out at the street, watching people pass by without awareness of what had come before, I understood that the story had never been about losing anything. It had always been about recognizing what was already mine, and now that I had, there was nothing left to reclaim, only something to live.